We'd like to give a special shout out to our sponsors. Without our sponsors, we would not be able to put this program on. Those sponsors are the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman, Utah Department of Commerce, Salt Lake County, and Denton, Durham, Jones, and Pinniger. And special appreciation to Denton. They provided the food for us, so thank you very much. We also have Institute partners who are instrumental in all of our activities. These include the Utah League of Cities and Towns, Utah Association of Realtors, the Salt Lake Association of Realtors, the Home Builders of Utah, the Real Estate Section of the Utah State Bar, and the Utah Chapter of the American Planning Association. Let's give our sponsors a round of applause for their support. Just a few housekeeping items. There are education credits available for this programming for many of you, and we'd invite you to look out in the lobby for a place where you can sign up. There'll probably be a little bit further detail on that later in the day as well, but please stop by and make sure that you sign up for your ed credits. There is Wi-Fi available here in the room. It's posted in the back, and you can find the password or the username and password back there. There's also some materials available to you out in the lobby, one of which is the Journal of Comparative Urban Law and Policy, which is a wonderful book. I thumbed through it last night after having gotten my copy yesterday, and it's pretty amazing. I think it's going to be a fun read. Invite you all to pick up your copy. The neat thing about this book is it also contains a special honor to one of our speakers today, Dr. Arthur C. Nelson, who we all know as Chris. Chris has been with us for many years. He serves on our board of directors of the Utah Land Use Institute, and a wonderful tribute to Dr. Nelson. So be sure and pick up your book. Well, without further ado, let's move to our programming for the day. I'll introduce Dr. Nelson, and he'll take it from here. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have the distinct pleasure of starting us with some thoughts. Where are we headed? I'll be introducing some major themes, some problems that we face, and then I'll introduce Bill Fulton, our guest speaker this morning, who will tell us how to solve every problem I'm going to mention. And so I'm going to talk about trends affecting Utah's future growth. Oops. How does this work? Doesn't work. Oh, it's a cold day in Utah. Do I point it someplace?
No. Oh, turn it on. Sorry, I didn't.
Turn it on?
On the left-hand side.
Imagine that. When in doubt, turn it on. So, one of the first issues we face in Utah is growth. The state says we're going to probably hit 7 million people by 2060. If you run the line to, say, 2100, we're looking at about 10 million people in Utah. And oh, by the way, I didn't put up a slide. So a baby born in Utah today will probably plan on living 120 years. So in addition to having growth by people being born, they will live a lot longer in the future than they have, of course, in the past. Now, let's look at the Wasatch Front from north of Ogden to south of Provo. This is an area that's roughly the same size and land area as Long Island, New York. Long Island, New York, of course, has Brooklyn and Queens and all the way out to the ocean. It's home to about 7 million people, Long Island is. we will have more than 7 million people in the Wasatch Front by the end of this century. And as I mentioned, people born today will be around to see that growth in the year 2100. Maybe some of us too, come to think of it. Of course, the critical problem is air pollution. We all know that. Some of us, me, others are affected by it more than others. This is a chart projecting the particulate or the pollution emissions by source to the year 2024. Notice that we're doing pretty well with the vehicular emission reductions, electric cars and better fuels and more fuel efficiency, everything else. That's the good news. But I'm surprised to find that, the other factors, the buildings, the factories, plants, they're increasing in emissions. And so while we're doing well on one, we're not doing nearly as well on the others, and actually we're getting worse over time. We talked a lot yesterday about water, and various people had various ways to measure water. I have my measurements too. If I'm using the USGS website for measuring water per capita, this is what I find, gallons per day per capita, using the exact same measurement from the federal source. We're running about 168 gallons per day in water consumption here, compared to 80 or so for Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Fe, and so on and so forth. Las Vegas was about 100 when I did this, but they're actually trending down towards 80 by mid-decade. So we have a lot of work we can do in terms of conserving water, but that has its own issues that as we talked about yesterday. And then are we meeting the demand for people in terms of what they want to live in? The National Association of Realtors does a survey every 3 years to find out what kind of community would people want to live in if they had the opportunities. It turns out that over the past several surveys, about half of American households, a little less than half, would want the opportunity to live in an attached home, condo, townhouse, or whatever, if they could walk, have an easy walk to shops and restaurants and a shorter commute to work. Half, that's a big number. We're not doing anywhere near that. Of course, the other half, they'd rather be on their lot and far away from things and drive to those places, and that's fine. But we're behind nationally and in Utah in terms of providing that opportunity for the other half that want the walkable community opportunities. Oops, something happened. As I'm walking off the stage here, it looks like. Okay, and then we have another issue. One of the best ways in which to meet housing demand is through infill redevelopment of already existing areas. This is a composite image of a project that actually Clark Ivory's working on in the avenues in Salt Lake City, just a few, 5 miles from here, I guess. This is a site that has, I forget how large it is, a couple acres. It's surrounded by townhouses and condominiums. But the neighbors, the townhouse neighbors and the condominium neighbors don't want this project, which is a townhouse project. It also has accessory dwelling units. I guess they don't want those people living near those people. I don't know the situation. But what's interesting to me is that when I run the census numbers, I find that the avenues falls about 300 housing units short of housing the same number of people it housed in 1990. Declining household size, fewer people per home. We had more people living in the avenues in 1990 than now. We need to bring those people back because we've already invested the money into the water and the sewer and the parks and the roads. Why do we have to spend that money all over again to house those people someplace else where we have to build those new water, sewer, and roads and so on and so forth? So I did a back of the envelope number. We have room for about 100,000, give or take, new residential units in the Wasatch Front in existing homes as accessory dwelling units or other kinds of opportunities. We need to take advantage of that more than we are. And then a shout out to committing our resources, our state resources, federal resources, to create public-private partnerships to do net zero water, net zero energy, net zero waste. We actually understand the technology now to create these net zero communities. And if we put our efforts into bringing these net zero communities to scale, my sense is that by the year 2050, which is just around the corner, we will have substantially reduced water demand, air pollution, emissions, and so on and so forth. And by the year 2100, we would be, in the Wasatch Front, at net zero waste, emissions, and so on, and water consumption. That's all feasible right now to start figuring out today. So these are the big issues from my perspective. We'll have, there we go. So following me will be Bill Fulton, who will talk about what can be done to address these and other issues. I want to spend a few minutes talking about Bill. I've known Bill for, since the 1990s. Bill is a journalist, he's a politician, he's a leader, he's a scholar. He's like everybody you want to be, all wrapped up into one. Bill was born in Auburn, New York. If anybody knows her history, another notable person hails from Auburn, New York, Harriet Tubman. So now I know where the rabble-rouser views of Bill Fulton comes from. Bill got his BA in journalism from St. Bonaventure and his master's in mass communication from American University. Well, in the 1980s, he decided to move west. Smart Easterners move west. So he moved west and got a master's in planning degree from UCLA. I think it's a Big Ten school now, that's what I hear. Then over the next 30 years or so, he became recognized as a leading voice, analyst, scholar in all things about California sprawl, smart growth, and so on and so forth, publishing numerous articles, appearing in numerous TV program, media programs. He became a fellow at USC, the other Big Ten school I hear. And then he moved on. During his time in LA, he became a politician. He first started as a planning commissioner in West Hollywood. Now, I've never been a planning commissioner. I've beat up a few, but I've been also beat up by a few planning commissioners in my career. This is a big deal, and Bill has interesting stories about his service on that planning commission in West Hollywood. Then he became a council member in Ventura, and later mayor of Ventura. But all the while, I would characterize Bill as being an agitator of small minds. You never want to get into a debate with Bill. I promise you. You don't want to do that. And then Bill became the founder or a leader in the Solimar research group in the 2000s that later merged with Berkeley. It's now called PlaceWorks, based in Berkeley. In the 2010s, he became a vice president in Washington, D.C. for Smart Growth America. Then he became planning director of the city of San Diego. And then between 2014 and 2021, he was the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. And it was there that he landed a $7 million grant to create the urban data platform, and also started numerous initiatives in urban and metropolitan governance, urban development, transportation and placemaking, and urban disparity and opportunity. And then he just recently finished a fellowship at the Berkeley Turner Center for Housing and Innovation. Bill is a scholar, a first-rate scholar. The top book there, upper left, is his 6th edition of Guide to California Planning. If you're going to do planning in California, you have to buy the book, take the test, pass the exam, everything else. Another book, The Reluctant Metropolis, about Los Angeles, became a LA Times bestseller. He wrote a book with Henry Cisneros, a former HUD director, former mayor of San Antonio, the Texas Triangle that separates the mythology of early Texas from the modern dynamo that Texas has become. He wrote a book called Talk City, which is sort of a memoir of his service as a politician in California. And maybe his most famous book from a planning perspective outside of California is The Regional City, which is an American Planning Association bestseller. He has a new book coming out called Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us to Connect and Innovate. And I'm waiting for that book to come out. so I can dive into it. So please welcome Mayor Bill Fulton.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. I hope that my talk is as long as the introduction. I'm Bill Fulton. I'm very happy to be back here in Salt Lake City again, visiting with old friends and talking about Utah growth issues. It's been a while, but it's been great to reconnect with people. As Chris said, I was the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice. I stepped down from that job in June. I actually still am a fellow at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at Berkeley, and I also work on budget management and economic development consulting projects for local governments around the country with PFM Consulting. I just pushed the right arrow, John, is that right? Okay. I'm going to talk. Later on, we'll have a panel where we talk about California, and as Chris said, I lived in California for 30 years, so I hopefully can bring you some lessons from California. The thing I want you to think about, the question was posed was how do we not become California, or how do we not make the mistakes California made? And as we get ready to have that conversation, and I'm giving this talk which is not really about California specifically, but we're going to talk about it later. I would ask you to think to yourself, okay, what exactly is it about California that we do not want here? Is it traffic congestion? Is it high home prices? Is it crazy politics? Is it more people? Is it a greater diversity of people? What is it that you actually don't want and you want to try to avoid? And then we can have, I think, a more useful conversation. I do want to talk, though, a little bit about, to expand on what Chris talked about the growth dynamics of Utah, and I'm not going to come up with all the solutions by 9 o'clock. We'll do that by 4. But I'm not going to come up with the solutions by 9. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. Typically, I'm the lunch speaker, and I do what Chris did. I set up the problem, and then I say, good luck. After lunch, I say, good luck. It's 1:30 now. My flight's at 3. Hope you do well. But today, I have to stay here all day and help you figure out how to solve the problem. But let me frame this a little bit for you. So yesterday, Craig sent this very a personable young man out to the airport to pick me up. And his job was to deliver me to the hotel, the Hyatt House across the street, and check me in, and then make sure I got here. And when I got to the Hyatt House, I said, don't worry, I can get over to the Realtors by myself, which is across the street. And he looked at me speechless. Like, you mean you're actually going to walk across a parking lot and across an arterial street and across another parking lot all by yourself without being driven in a big pickup truck, which is what he was driving? He just couldn't believe that I was willing to do that. And I think my point is, so I have traversed the street several times already since I arrived yesterday. I have managed to dodge all the cars. There are no sidewalks to guide me. There is a sidewalk around this building, so apparently you're supposed to walk around this building, but you're not supposed to walk from this building to anywhere else because there's no sidewalks. And the point I want to make there is this is your present in many parts of the Salt Lake City area. This is your present. We are in the middle of a pretty dense business district, right? There's this building, there's a multi-story hotel next door. Next door to that, there's a tall office building. All of these buildings are surrounded by parking lots, which are surrounded by arterial streets. There's really no reason for a business district to be this auto-oriented, and yet this one is. A business district is a place where you come for a long period of time, you do a variety of things, and this one is set up on the assumption that whenever you do anything, you get in your car and you drive across the street to do it. That is not unusual in America, but it represents some of the challenges that additional growth in the Salt Lake City area creates. So let me talk a little bit more about what your present is. This is what children going to elementary school looks like today. Any of you have children in elementary school? Yes, so you all know, you're familiar with the pickup line, right? I'm old enough to remember when there were no pickup lines because everybody walked to school. Something like, in my generation, something like 90% of American kids walk to school. Today, something like 90% of American kids are driven to school by their parents. This is what it takes for a child to get to elementary school these days. This is 30 people getting their morning drink. This is what it takes for 30 people in America to get their morning drink on their way to work in the morning. This is the present, not only for you, but in many parts of America. Here's something I found online this morning. This is land for 4 families in Provo. It's 100 acres. 4 families, 100 acres. And, not surprisingly, as you know, this is your home price trend. Just like other places in the United States, especially in the attractive cities in the Intermountain West, your home prices are out of sight. This is your present. This is your present. And as Chris said, it's only going to get tougher because of the increased population growth. You got what? How many people in Utah now? 2.5, 5, 4, and you're going to go to 7? Okay. So the question is, if that's your present, what does your future look like if you continue the current trend? Is this your future? This is the Katy Freeway, I-10 in Houston, or as I jokingly call it, being from LA, the Santa Monica Freeway. They don't like it when I call it that in Houston. This is the Katy Freeway near my house. It has 26 lanes. It is the largest freeway in the United States. It used to be the largest freeway in the world until the Chinese built the freeway wider in China. This freeway was expanded dramatically in about 2010. It is now completely clogged, and TxDOT is talking about expanding it some more. So is this your future? This is a proposed expansion of I-35 in downtown Austin. TxDOT, I live in Texas, so TxDOT's on my mind. TxDOT is proposing expanding I-35 to 20 lanes through the middle of the hottest urban real estate market in the country in a metropolitan area that's only 2 million people. This is what the downtown of the hottest city in America in a metro area with only 2 million people is going to look like if the state DOT has its way. This is the extension of the current trend. Is this your future? This would be a good deal today in California. 1.1 million for a house. The average home price in California until interest rates started to rise was pretty close to $1 million. You want to know why so many Californians are coming to Salt Lake City and Boise and everywhere else in the Intermountain West? It's because they got a ton of home equity and they want to bail out of California, Southern California or the Bay Area, right? California is exporting its urban growth problem here. California actually, and we'll talk about this more, California has become so expensive, so congested, and in many ways so unattractive that for the first time in 170 years, the population is going down. For the first time, an unimaginable thing to anybody from California. So is this your future? Or is this your future? This is one of my favorite pictures from California. Black lives matter, but apparently not enough to build an apartment building down the street from my single-family house. Right? Is the future as it has been in California? Everybody digs in their single-family neighborhood and resists additional growth and change. And I think one of the things we have to think about when we think about if you don't want to be California is how do you address resistance to change? I always call myself a municipal psychologist. Throughout my career, and Chris did a good job of outlining my career, I have helped cities work through the wrenching transition from thinking of themselves as suburban to thinking of themselves as urban as they have run out of land. It's a very difficult transition. And what typically happens is, as you know better than I do, the longtime homeowners dig their heels in and they say, we don't want anything to change. And that's why I posed the question to you at the beginning is, what is it that you don't want? And what is it that you do want? And what trade-offs are you willing to make to get from one place to another? I had an experience when I was the planning director of San Diego where I got shouted down by 300 people at a public meeting who lived in a single-family neighborhood near a transit stop where a light rail was supposed to go in. It was about to be built after 30 years of planning. And the only way I could think of to deal with that situation was to subsequently go house to house and talk to everybody in their kitchen and their living room. And they were longtime homeowners. Many of them were older. And when you got right down to it, what they said is, we don't want things to change. We are afraid of change. If you really drill down, that's what they said. And people, have to deal with change all the time in their life. Everything changes all the time, and that's very difficult for people to deal with. It's very disorienting. And so what people don't want is they don't want change to follow them home, right? And yet, everything in your neighborhood is changing all the time in some ways. Your trees grow, your grass grows, you have to cut the grass. Your kids grow up. Your new families move in. So I think the question is not, how do we resist change? How do we make change not happen? The question is, how do you manage change, and what kind of change do you want? I think you have to reframe the question. I got off on a bit of a tangent with this slide. This is in Berkeley, I think, by the way, one of the most liberal cities in America. The NIMBY attitudes cut across all political boundaries. 20 years ago, you were not afraid to tackle this problem. When you began when you started up Envision Utah, and you this region inspired an entire country and an entire generation of planners by undertaking Envision Utah and by working with Fregana C. Calthorpe at the time to come up with what was commonly known at the time as the chip game. The chip game, where you had chips that represented growth, and you had to lay them down on a map of the region to figure out where they go. That was a revolutionary idea at the time, and so revolutionary and so inspiring, in fact, that as Chris said, Peter Calthorpe and I wrote an entire book based on inspired by the experience that you had here. So what's happened? So how do you get from this to 30 people winding their cars around the block to get their morning drink? How do you go from this to me walking across an arterial street into two parking lots just to get from my hotel to here this morning? Well, you've done a lot of really, really good things. These are just a couple of images of some of the things that have been done, not in downtown Salt Lake City, but in suburban areas in the vicinity of Salt Lake. You've done some really good things. You've invested a lot of money in transit. You're putting together some good districts. But overall, you're on the trend. You're not off the trend. You're on the path to California and Texas. And I go back to Austin again. I live in Houston, but I'm spending a lot of time in Austin lately because I've been teaching at the LBJ School at University of Texas. And Austin is kind of the center of the universe right now, right? And I'm really, really struck by the contrast between the incredible, dense, urban, efficient growth that is being built in downtown Austin and TxDOT's plans for that 20-lane freeway right through the middle of downtown. That is the clash between what we used to call smart growth back in the day and the traditional highway engineering and the traditional moving forward of the trend. Right? If you have a congestion problem, what you do is you increase car capacity, right? And I think it just strikes me that if you continue on the overall trend in the region, that's where you're going to be. You're going to be a relatively small metropolitan area by national standards compared to Houston or LA or the Bay Area or New York. And yet you're going to wind up with 20-lane freeways. Is that really the future you want? Do you really want a future where I have to walk from the Hyatt House to here across two parking lots and arterial street with no sidewalks? Is that the growth future of Salt Lake City? Is that the growth future of Houston? Because if it's not, then you're going to get California and Texas. You're going to get $1 million houses, home prices, which you already have in some places. You're going to get serious traffic congestion and tremendous pressure to continually increase your highway system. The end result of which will be more traffic, right? I have a friend in Houston who's a defender of bigger freeways, who says, well, at least there's more cars going slowly than there were before. More people are traveling, at least more people who want to go somewhere are accommodated by being stuck in a traffic jam than would otherwise be the case. So that's a net good thing, he says. If, however, you don't want this result, then I think you got to go back to the original ideas of Envision Utah. You got to go back, I think, to the values that Utahns have, which emerged as a result of Envision Utah. The family orientation, the understanding about 7 generations ahead, the long-term thinking, the understanding that the current trend was unsustainable. And you got to tackle this. This is very hard. This is unbelievably hard. As you know, those of you in the trenches know more than I do how difficult this is, and it's easy for me to stand up here and tell you that you should do this. It's much harder for you to go out and do this. But I will say it's easier to do it now than it will be in 2060 when you've got 7 million people. Because what you see in California now, and I will talk about this in the panel discussion, what you see in California now is a desperate attempt to reverse the trends of the last 50 to 70 years. You see and you've seen this in the news just in the last few days, very aggressive state efforts to override local land use control in order to increase the supply of housing, now that housing is unaffordable to half of all Californians. You see an unbelievable amount of investment, especially in LA, in transit. There is more transit being built in LA than there is anywhere else in the Western world. And yet, transit ridership in LA, even before the pandemic, was going down. Why? Because the underlying land use pattern doesn't support it. The houses are all scattered. It's just too inconvenient for most people to take transit to get where they need to go, whether it's work or anywhere else. Poor people have to do it. They have no choice because they have no economic choice. But most people don't do it because the land use pattern that was set in LA from 1920 to 1990, say, has made it almost impossible to retrofit that region. And what you're doing now is, to some extent, retrofitting your region, and to some extent, trying to tackle the question of new growth. You've got an opportunity now because compared to a place like LA, you are a relatively small and young metropolitan area. You have that opportunity, but you've got to be aggressive about it, and you've got to take it on, and I think you've got to show the rest of the country that there is a Utah way to do this, and a responsible, sustainable way to do this that is consistent with your values, which are unique in America, that can take this problem on, because otherwise you're going to wind up with the Austin problem. You're going to wind up with the $1 million houses and the 20-lane freeways. And again, I challenge you to say, is that really what you want? Because that's the path you're on. That's the path we're all on in the United States. Salt Lake is not unusual in that respect. And you're doing some good things, as most metropolitan areas are, but they're being done on the margins. And the question is, can you turn the trend around so that you have, so you take advantage of the infill opportunities that Chris described, which are substantial, and that you figure out how to make sure that the new areas are more sustainable and are not as auto-oriented. Because it does seem to me, I once heard Richard Florida make this observation, I think it's right, a metro area gets to a certain size, and it's somewhere between 3 and 5 million people probably, and you just can't, it just won't work with everybody driving everywhere all the time by themselves anymore. There comes a point where that just doesn't work anymore, and you're on the cusp of that, and you can turn that around. But that requires a tremendous amount of dedication and effort. It requires a tremendous amount of political will. And it requires a tremendous amount of political will on the part of local officials who don't want to get stepped on by the legislature. Because the alternative for you is to get stepped on by the legislature to solve this problem. So I am no expert on Utah. I am no expert on the Salt Lake City metropolitan area. I do think that you have a unique opportunity given your geographical location, your size, your growth trajectory, and your values. And I challenge you to renew the way you thought about this 20 years ago when Envision Utah began, and really take it upon yourself to learn the lessons, good and bad, from other places. And I'll talk about the lessons, good and bad, from California in the panel discussion. And really bend the trend so that you have a truly sustainable metropolitan area that will work in 2050 and will work in 2100 and will work for people who can't afford cars, and will work for people who won't be able to drive. Because I think one of the points Chris didn't make is people who are 120 years old are not likely to be driving, right? They are not likely to be driving. So I challenge you to take that on and renew this region's distinguished commitment to these issues. And I'm happy to help in any way, and I'm happy to talk about this more, and especially I'll talk more about the pros and cons and the good and bad lessons that you can learn from California in the panel discussion. So it is true, it's out, the book is out, Chris. I just published a book called Place and Prosperity, which talks about the importance of a sense of place and the interrelationship between that and economic development and prosperity. That's available now. Anyway, I had to put the ad in, sorry. But thanks very much for having me today, and I've been really looking forward to this panel discussion where we talk about California. And again, I challenge you to ask the question, when you ask the questions of us, what precisely is it about California that you do not want? Not just, oh, we hate it. We don't want that. What is it that you don't want? And then what decisions and trade-offs do you have to make to not have that result? And I hope we move forward and have that discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris and Bill. Excellent. We've got the right team on the job this morning. I'm only here for a second to express the regrets of Doug Wilkes, who had certainly planned to be here and moderate this conversation. Doug's the executive editor of the Deseret News. However, he had something come up at the institution that he couldn't pass on, so he gave us the benefit of having Katie McKeller here instead. Katie does political coverage for the Deseret News. She's part of the in-depth team. She has won multiple awards from the Utah Society of Professional Journalists. She's a Utah native. She studied journalism at Utah Technical University, enjoys mountain biking and horseback riding, and moderating controversial political discussions. So here we go, Katie.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to be here, to be moderating such a great panel of people. I've got a fun discussion today titled Exactly What About California? And that's a pretty loaded way to start this discussion about housing, right? To talk about what we don't want to become, but what is it about California that makes people so angry? In my reporting, I've been covering a lot of the housing market. I do hear kind of a lot, blame the Californians, we're becoming California, or we don't want to become California. And so to start this discussion, I would like to get your knee-jerk reaction from each one of you guys about just how do you react to those kind of comments? And I think Bill's question about what is it about California that makes people so mad? If we could get at that to start, that would be great. But first, can we start by introducing Clark Ivory? Can you tell us your background and what you deal with day to day.
Been building homes for a while now. We've built 25,000 homes in Utah, 3,000 apartments, and we're trying to figure out this current market right now. That's what I'm doing every day, and it's interesting. I'll just give you some stats so you understand what's happening to housing in Utah. You know, we've been red hot until really after the first quarter of this year, and then we started to see homes. The number of homes being built has gone way down as we've seen interest rates on the rise. We were consistently building in Utah, single-family and townhomes, about 2,000 a month, starting 2,000 a month, and then all of a sudden this summer, things just started plummeting. 1,294 in July. September down 63% over last year's September, 783. So we can see a big correction happening right now. The supply is dropping so rapidly that while there will be some price reductions, truthfully, the lack of supply of housing this next year will be significant, and there won't be nearly as much price, reductions as what maybe some people are forecasting. So anyway, those are just a couple of brief thoughts, but I build homes.
And Alan Matheson, tell us about where you come from and the point.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm Alan Matheson. I'm the outlier here. I don't have nearly the expertise of the others, but in terms of background, I had the opportunity to lead Envision Utah in the early 2000s. I've worked in the governor's office, state planning coordinator and policy advisor. Then did something to offend the governor, and he made me the executive director of the Department of Environmental Quality and put me in the crosshairs for a few years. But frankly, I decided I wanted to build rather than regulate and put into practice some of these ideas that have been talked about this morning, and we'll talk about more. So I'm the executive director of the Point of the Mountain State Land Authority, responsible for building out the development at the Point, where the Draper Prison is currently located. So a terrific opportunity to have essentially a 600-acre blank canvas in a very fast-growing metropolitan region, where there's a high-tech sector that is growing in national and international recognition with existing infrastructure. But essentially, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, trying to create a model of how we can grow thoughtfully, addressing the fears that people have with growth. Growth is coming. But if you can't just pull up the drawbridge and stop growth, let's figure out how we can grow more thoughtfully. So I think this is an opportunity we've got to take advantage of.
Awesome. So let's open up this discussion. When you hear those types of comments about we don't want to become like California, what is your knee-jerk reaction? And let's start with Clark.
Well, first off, I think we don't want to be like California was, but actually we want to be like California is right now. As you know, we run Hybrid Innovations at the University of Utah, which is looking at the best housing ideas across the country in regulatory reform, construction design, and in finance. And I would say there's not another state that's producing more innovative ideas right now than California. Now, granted, they're behind the 8 ball more than almost any other, so they need to do it, so it's out of necessity. But great ideas are coming out of California, and truthfully, while they're not all great ideas, there's a lot of ideas we want to imitate, and we're trying to share across the country.
Great. We can get into more specifics along those lines of what those ideas are, but I also want to hear Dr. Nelson's reaction to those type of comments. And as you look at Utah's growth trajectory, how do we grapple with those types of comments coming from Utahns?
I hope this is on. It's not on and off challenged this morning, it seems. I want to start by saying I'm a buyer of Clark Ivory's homes. When I moved here in the early 2000 teens, I looked for opportunities to buy homes for rentals, and Clark had these opportunities for me, so thank you, Clark.
Very well.
I want to turn it sort of around, and I think Clark actually touched on it. What is it that California, what makes California appealing? Good weather, opportunities for jobs, opportunities for families. And now, as Bill alluded to earlier, California has lost its edge. It's losing people for the first time since statehood because it's become unmanageable, it's become inefficient. But what are the lessons that California has generated that we can learn from, positive and negative? And I think Bill actually has a lot of ideas there since he was active there and still remains active in California. Whenever I have an opportunity to go to California, I take it. I like going to California. I like visiting with the people. I like visiting the places, the downtowns, even the suburban areas. There's a certain dynamic in California that's exciting to me. And there's lots of innovation going on. Yes, we hear the bad stuff all the time, but you go below the surface and you see a lot of very interesting neighborhoods, communities, innovative ideas at all levels of government. A friend of mine actually, when I first began planning many years ago now, almost 50 years ago I've been in planning, my mentor said, you know, if you want to learn about a problem that's going to face American planners first, look to California, because they will see the problem first before anybody else does. Find out what the problem is from California's perspective, see how they address them, and so we see now in the housing arena, California legislature is maybe going overboard by telling local governments what they can't do and what they must do. Sea change in California. In a sense, the legislature has had it with the local governments. And I heard some fellow in California say one day, well, local governments had it coming to them. For so long, for decades, local governments were the king and queen of California. And the legislature says, enough, it's not working, it's time that we change the playing field, and they have, and they are. But I want to touch a little bit too on what Utah's doing. A couple of years ago, 2021 I think, Utah passed the Accessory Dwelling Unit Act. For those who don't know this, basically every city, every county, every government in Utah has to allow an accessory dwelling unit by right. There's some exceptions, of course. But the one thing that Utah does that no other state does is Utah says also CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and homeowner associations have no jurisdiction in deciding whether people can put an ADU in their home. No other state does that. This is remarkable, and I think that we're going to see some interesting, important changes as a consequence in Utah. And I'm rambling on too much, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would make the following observation. My conclusion from all those years in California that I want to convey today is, don't build what you want your future to be on a negative. Don't build what you want your future to be based on that you don't want to be someplace else. Because that is what happened in California over the last 40 years. Up until around 1980, California built itself on a positive. You know, we are the American dream. They invested a lot in infrastructure. They built a lot of communities. Yes, they built a lot of suburban single-family homes, but it was very successful. Starting in about 1980, California's attitude changed. We don't want, that's when Prop 13 passed, the property tax limitation. That's when the shift began to requiring lots of impact fees and so forth, putting all the cost of growth on the new development. There was an organization in Los Angeles that was a citizen organization that named itself Not Yet New York, There was an organization in San Diego that named itself Not Yet Los Angeles. And the whole, and of course there were repeated attempts to use land use regulations to pull up the drawbridge behind people in community after community for the reasons that Chris described. And did growth control, did 40 years of growth control in California work? Yes, it finally worked. Finally, California is losing population. Is that what people really wanted in the end? They didn't want any more people in their community, but did they want this outcome from California? I don't think so. And so I think that the most important thing Utahns can do is turn it around and say, not what do we not want to be? Because it's a very easy thing to do, and it's a very common thing to do in land use and growth debates. But what do we want to be? Which is much more difficult. But to me, that's the lesson from California from the last 40 years. Is California has not had a positive vision of what it wants to be since 1980. And that has damaged the state dramatically. And that led to underinvestment, it led to resistance to growth, it led to lots of other negative things. And so I would encourage you to not define yourself by not wanting to be California, but to define yourself by wanting to be Utah and defining what that means and pursuing that.
Yeah, go on. I'd say amen to a lot of that. I don't have anything against California. I did my undergraduate work in Northern California and got a law degree in Southern California and lived there, and had great experiences. But I also saw some of the challenges of unplanned or unthoughtful growth. I remember a day trying to get home to Arizona. It took me 4 hours to get from West LA to downtown LA, and then 6 hours to get from downtown LA to Phoenix. So it was, traffic was an issue. I remember one of the rainy days that came a few months after I had arrived there, and I wondered where those mountains had come from. I hadn't seen the mountains, air quality issues. I saw the prices of housing, and when offered jobs there, I thought, well, I can live in a cardboard box in Balboa Park or something else. So, we've seen these challenges over time, but as has been alluded to, and as I think we'll talk about more, there are a lot of lessons that can be learned as well. And I do worry that sometimes we say we don't want to be California, and yet we're continuing some of the same development patterns that created some of the challenges. There is a lot of innovation going on, and I'll just harken back to some of my experience at DEQ. We're trying to address air quality challenges here in Utah, and one of the first places we looked was California. Now they've done some things that we don't think make sense here, part of it because of the difference in atmospheric chemistry and what strategies work and don't work. But we adopted a lot of the things that they were doing, and it has made a difference. There's more to be done, obviously. I think it's important for us, as has already been said, not to say we don't want to be that. There are challenges there, there are political challenges there. I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine last week who has an outdoor gear company that opened an office or opened a retail facility in San Francisco, and says every week organized theft comes in and robs him every other day at least. And there's not much of a response to that from the police. There's a significant homeless issue, feces on the sidewalks everywhere. And so that's become a challenge. Now, I don't want to create policy by anecdote, but I think there are some lessons there about the association between how we develop our communities and our sense of pride in a community, and that translates into social impacts as well. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later, but opportunity to see potential futures, opportunity to learn from decisions and innovations being made now.
Awesome. So let's start with that question then. What do we want to become in your minds here in Utah? What has specifically something that California has done that we don't want to do? Are there examples of California that, what it has done that we should do? What do we want to be here in Utah? Go ahead, Clark.
A couple of thoughts. First of all, the way they've driven up fees, and we heard this already from Bill, but Fremont, California, you want to go get a building permit, you're going to pay about $160,000 before you dig your foundation, just to get started. And of course, this is now, you know, for many cities, their mechanism for not really taxing people in a more reasonable way, but it's the only way they can figure out how to collect their revenue. We don't want to do that. And so we need to keep property taxes reasonable, but we also need to make sure that fees for newly built homes remain reasonable. And so that's number one. Number two, I think we've got to be more balanced than California in our energy policy. They're pushing right now for electrification. I drive an electric car. We put a EV charger in every house. We've been driving our HERS scores down to almost lower than any other builder. We're very, very much in favor of doing all we can to have more sustainable homes. At the same time, I was in California this summer, staying in Orange County, and I was there during a roving blackout. You know, I mean, I didn't have power for, 36 hours down there. They are too dependent on electricity now, and they're forcing every new build to be totally electrified, and that hurts affordability. And the truth is, most of their power is dirty anyway. So until they get the infrastructure figured out to get really clean electrical power, that's not going to make sense. We need a more balanced approach with clean and renewable sources, both natural gas and electricity. And I think Utah can figure that out much better than California. We can accomplish a lot of our clean air goals, and I think we're committed to that. I think we'll also do what we need to do with water. We're a little bit behind on that. I love what Brad Wilson's doing at the state. Our company's supporting the efforts to help save the Great Salt Lake, but there's a lot of things we're going to do with water going forward, and that will be a focus, and we need to do that more than most states. So those are just a few thoughts, and I think what Utah will focus on, but I think Utah's good at balancing things out, taking not a Democratic or Republican approach, but a common sense approach.
Chris, any thoughts on, what we can learn from California, any specifics of what Utah should do or what you think Utah should become?
Yes. California has been a leader in a lot of innovative community design, and we are too. I think that sort of building on what Clark is saying, what are the lessons from California in the construction, in the design world, and Bill mentions this too, that we can refine and apply to Utah. And I want to go back to a little factoid I presented earlier this morning, and sort of get back to what Clark was talking about in terms of fees. We are about 100,000 dwelling units short of re-peopling existing neighborhoods for the population that they were in 1990. So we build a lot of new homes because we have smaller households now than 1990. And so we have to build new water systems and sewer systems and everything else. What if we found a way to create those opportunities to house those same people in existing neighborhoods? Accessory dwelling units, the infill project I mentioned that Clark is working on actually, and the avenues and so forth. And then what if we had a sweetener? Gosh, if we built the infrastructure to accommodate 100,000 homes in 1990, let's say 2020s, what if we didn't have impact fees on those homes that simply repopulated the same neighborhoods to the population levels they were in 1990? what's an impact fee? An impact fee is a charge on new development to offset the cost of infrastructure that new development impacts on. Well, what if you already have the water and the sewer and the parks and the roads in an area? What is the impact if you're putting in homes that simply bring the population back up to where it was when you built that community? That would be $10,000, $20,000 per home in most communities in the Wasatch Front. That would be saved. That could help reduce housing costs. It would stimulate housing production. And then let me go back to what I mentioned earlier. A person born today who's likely to live to 120. Actually, the IRS tables for the individual retirement accounts now go to 113. So they've been thinking about this for a long time. Where does a person live when they're in their 80s and 90s, when they can't take care of their large house and their large lot and so on and so forth? But what if they don't want to move into assisted living or such? This is where the accessory dwelling unit or some other alternative opportunities for seniors to live in. And by the way, one of the concerns that I've seen around the country, a person lives, a new subdivision is built, families move in, the families know each other, their kids go to school together, they create social networks, kids are gone, empty nesters, and the parents have no choice. There's no place for the parents to move to because there's no townhouse or smaller house or cottage opportunity in the neighborhood where they have their social networks established. They have no choice but to stay in their home longer than they should, which means that the next family waiting to move into that house with the kids has to move someplace else. What if we found ways to retrofit existing neighborhoods so that the parents, the empty nesters, have a choice to move into something a little smaller in the same neighborhood? So we create the cycling of households based on the life cycle of the families. California's actually done some of these, not many, but we can learn some lessons from what California communities have done in this area. So I think there's a lot of sort of forward thinking we can do with our existing land use patterns, our existing zoning codes, and we probably ought to do them in Utah before the legislature tells us to do these things, because every community is just a little different, and a top-down, you shall do this, probably doesn't work everywhere. Just some thoughts.
Great.
I want to go back to what Clark said about impact fees and the property tax system, because I think there's a very important set of warnings from California there. You're all familiar with the fact that California has a very extreme property tax limitation statute, which is actually passed by initiative in 1978 called Proposition 13. Proposition 13 basically freezes your property tax. It freezes your assessment at the level it was at when you bought your house, and it limits overall property tax rates from all taxing entities to 1%. So you pay 1% of what you paid for your house basically forever, and that is divided among different taxing jurisdictions under a formula created by the state legislature. So I was mayor of Ventura. Ventura gets about 15% of the property tax. What that means is I got 15% of 1% of what, every year I got 15% of 1% of whatever you paid for your house whenever you bought your house. That's a pretty extreme system. What that did more than anything else was it severed the relationship between tax rates and services provided, right? There's no discussion about what the tax rate should be and what services should be provided. Doesn't happen. But the other thing it did was it destroyed the sense of community responsibility for growth and how to pay for it. And it created an attitude in California that is often articulated by the phrase, growth must pay for itself. That new development has to cover all the cost created by that development. And in fact, sometimes even more than the cost, because there's existing deficits in service provision and infrastructure. Although that's technically illegal, that doesn't mean it never happens. So it really created an us versus them mentality on the part of Californians, and it destroyed this sense of community around how your city or your neighborhood grows. And that's why impact fees are so high. And as Clark quite rightly said, cities have no choice but to impose high impact fees because they can't get the money out of the property tax, right? The other thing it did was, which is not unusual but more extreme in California, is it created tremendous competition for retailers because property taxes were restrained, sales taxes were not. And so, you know, as is the case in many places, retailers were seen as more as a profit center for cities. But the most important point I want to make is, this comes out in various ways in different states. When you begin to restrict property taxes and you push more responsibility for development onto the new development, you break this sense of community responsibility and you create this us versus them attitude, which I think has been very destructive in California. And to the extent that you pursue, as many states have, property tax restrictions and so forth, I would encourage you to find a way to do it that doesn't create that mentality.
Alan, the point is, it's been discussed as the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something different. Bring us into that conversation, and you know, what has California done that we must not do at the point, or is there something that California has done that we could model? Just what is our opportunity here, and you know, what could be different?
Unlike California, and unlike, say, the Northeast, a good chunk of your growth, if not most of it, is still ahead of you. That's an opportunity. That's an opportunity California had in 1960 or 1970. So if you're going to bend the trend, start bending it now, and you have to do it with a different land use pattern. You simply have to. What's happened in California, both in the Bay Area and LA, and this is very familiar, you will understand this, is you've had regional investment in transit and local land use decisions that have sometimes undercut the transit infrastructure, right? Or have frequently done that. You've had in LA local officials who sit on the Metro board who have driven the transit infrastructure into locations to benefit them so that they can cut ribbons. But they represent affluent communities that don't want more housing. They want the light rail, they don't want any more housing. So that severability between transit infrastructure and land use decision making has been, the transit infrastructure investment in LA in particular has been extremely impressive. But it's been severed from the land use decisions. That's typical of the United States. It's true here as well. But you can see what's happening now is the legislature is trying to play catch up to try to force different land use decisions in the vicinity of the transit investments, right? And they're stepping on the local governments to do it. So I think what has to happen is the local governments have to realize, or have to believe, we got to solve this problem ourselves with a more consistent set of smart growth land use policies, or else the state's going to step on us. The state's going to solve the problem for us. And in California, the local governments did not believe that. They did not believe that would ever happen, and it has. So that's my warning about that.
Alan, the point and where it fits into this.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start a little bigger picture and then work to the point. You know, one of the challenges is transportation always. How do you get people where they want to be? And traditionally, departments of transportation have focused on expanding capacity in the road systems, the freeways, to meet the demand as it comes along. Yesterday I was at the UDOT conference, and Carlos Braceras, the executive director, stood up and he made the point that if we're going to double in size, in population by 2060, does that mean then that all of the roadways we see now and all the freeways we see now need to be replicated and double to meet that need? He said, of course not. That's just not feasible, and it's not the kind of community we want. So he said, going forward, we really have to make better decisions. Transit has to be a big part of it. Our land use patterns have to be a big part of it. And that's not a new concept in Utah. We've been talking about that, as we heard, since the late 1980s, early 1990s with Envision Utah. I was involved with the metropolitan planning organizations in this state, Wasatch Front Regional Council, Mountain Land Association of Governments, developing Wasatch Choice 2040 and now Wasatch Choice 2050, where we're looking at how we can design this community around centers. You have different hierarchies of development centers connected by transit and thoughtful transportation. That's a viable way of growing more economically, getting people where they need to be, using less water, improving air quality, et cetera. And so the point kind of fits in with that model as one of these key centers. It's in, as we said, fast-growing area, an area of opportunity, an area where there is existing transportation infrastructure with I-15 and Bangor and future transit. So as we think, let me just say, one of the lessons I've learned over time is concepts don't motivate people, but models do. If you can go to a place and look at it and say, that's working, the developer can make money here, it's the kind of place people want to be. People are investing in living there. If it passes the market test, then it's going to be replicated. And so we feel a heavy responsibility to make the point one of those places. A place where people will want to be, where we can demonstrate that we can use less water, that we can minimize the impacts on air quality, that we can provide a range of housing types to reflect the jobs at the site. So those that work at the site can live at the site. And let me just dive in a little bit on the transportation piece where I started. So we need to, especially in that narrow neck of land that we have between Utah and Salt Lake County, minimize off-site traffic generation. So we've been exploring a range of strategies that include putting high-capacity transit through the site and down into Utah County, internal circulators at the site that would get people within a 5-minute walk of any spot at the point, mobility hubs where you can go and get a car share, short-term rental of a vehicle if you need it, where you could get a scooter or an electric bike. Apps that would allow you to say, here's where I am, this is where I need to be, and it'll show you the range of transportation options that you have, how much each of them cost, how long it'll take to get there, et cetera. The land use pattern is critical. So you might have heard of a planning concept called the 15-minute city, meaning you design a city so that you can access your day-to-day needs within a 15-minute walk. And the point is ideally sized for a 15-minute city. So again, trying to create little districts within the site that have retail, that have commercial, that have jobs, that have housing. And so with the land use, with those transportation options, et cetera, we've modeled about a 35% reduction in traffic generation on the site, creating what we call a one-car community. You wouldn't need more than one car to live there. That's, that 35% is kind of world-class. Now we've got to implement it, but that's part of the goal.
Great. Go ahead.
Follow up. Alan's comment made me think of something that I thought of earlier. Chris compared the Wasatch Front to Long Island. If you turn Long Island on its side, but it was very clever of you to turn Long Island on end like that. I've always been struck by the similarity in the urban morphology of the Salt Lake area to Seattle. You've got a very strong freeway corridor down the middle, I-5. You've got water to the west. You've got mountains to the east. You're pretty boxed in. You're pretty pinched. At about the same time that Envision Utah began, Puget Sound Regional Council did a regional plan, quite similar actually, which called for strong light rail up and down along sort of near the I-5 corridor, and about 20 different centers. And their goal was, which had, those 20 different centers had, I'm rounding off the numbers here, but had 20% of the jobs and 5% of the housing in the region. And the goal was to increase the 5% of the housing in the region to 20%. And they did that. They did that and you didn't. Now, why was that? And that's a pretty good model to look at. There are a number of different reasons why. There was a very significant investment in transit. There was a bigger central city than you have, which might be part of it. There was more of a local commitment, and there is in Washington State, there has been for perhaps 30 years, a very strong state level land use appeals court. Developer doesn't like the outcome. At the local level, they appeal to this state land use court, which is not made up of lawyers necessarily. The judges are not necessarily lawyers, they're land use experts. The chair of the state land use court is, not surprisingly, the single most unpopular person in the entire state of Washington, right? No one would actually want that job. But there was something about the way that the Seattle area went about this that allowed them to make more difference than just on the margin compared to you. And I think that's worth further exploration.
Great. So let's talk about what the Utah solution should be. We've heard a lot about how land use patterns are key. So what specific land use patterns do we need to reverse now to accommodate this growth? We've got, some open land on the west side of south end, west side of the valley. We've also got a lot of the Wasatch Front already built out. And so what do cities need to do now to step in before the legislature does more than it already has?
Couple of ideas. One that we've been pushing for some time is there's so many retail centers across our various cities, municipalities throughout the Wasatch Front that are no longer productive. And I think we need to make those by right residential zones that have significant density. It's something that Chris Cambroulis and I have been talking about for a long time in our shop, and really believe would make a significant impact and shouldn't have that much opposition. It is hard for cities to come to the realization that retail area that had provided them with sales tax is no longer going to be productive going forward. But if they can see the future and know how that will really end up, they're better off more quickly coming to the conclusion that it needs to be more dense housing, which may help what little retail can survive to survive. So I think that's one thing. I think Chris has talked about ADUs, and we'll continue to push on that. It's actually much easier to do ADUs when you're building new. Shoehorning everything in is tough. That's why we're trying to do it up in the avenues, and we've done a little sample in Midvale. We're going to do another thing at Daybreak. We've got a variety of places where we're going to demonstrate how you can do new construction with ADUs and do it right. So I think cities can get on board there and encourage newly constructed ADUs, because it's so much easier to get the utilities in the right places and to really have the parking figured out, which is difficult when you're shoehorning it into an existing neighborhood. So I think that's another way that we're going to really approach it. I think what little land we have left in infill areas needs to get significant density. So those three things, I think, over time can really have an impact on the way we develop. so that we are more like Seattle.
I wanted to pick up on two things that Clark said I think are very relevant. One of the most useful things somebody could do, and I've been talking to people about doing this in California too, is to model what that fiscal transition looks like from retail to dense housing. The typical city manager's gut reaction, as Clark said, is I don't want to lose my sales tax, and housing costs me money, right? And so to really model what that looks like, somebody modeling what that looks like financially, I think is a very useful thing. I forgot to tell the story about ADUs in California, but I think this one thing that California finally got right, and that has made a big impact. From the 70s to about 2017, for 40 years, the state and the locals fought over ADUs. The state would make it easier to build ADUs, and then the locals would put up obstacles. Finally, in 2017, the state said, under certain circumstances, ADUs are always by right. And you had to meet the circumstances and not everything. But the net result for that in LA, in the city of Los Angeles, was the number of ADU permits went up from the year before the law passed, there were a couple of hundred, and the year after the law passed, there were several thousand. It was a very dramatic increase. And now it's gotten to the point in both LA and the Bay Area where there's an ADU industry. There are companies that, it's kind of like buying a car, like I was telling somebody last night. You go online, you see the models, you pick out your model, they come and drop it in your backyard. It's become, it's essentially production modular home building. And this has made a significant dent in the housing situation in California simply by that one state law that switched ADUs from being discretionary to by right.
Chris, your thoughts?
Well, I was going to defer to Alan, actually. Some years ago, when Alan was running Envision Utah, Alan came up with the 3% solution. It's basically taking the whatever little land we have left in the Wasatch Front and doing a lot better job with it. I'd like to have Alan sort of rethink that, refresh the memory on that for us.
You may have to help me remember. I can't remember. Yeah, the concept was that you don't need to totally change the urban fabric throughout the region. People want to live in the neighborhoods they're in for various reasons. And I think there's this sense that people, we heard it earlier, people don't want to change. And there's this sense that if we keep doing things the way we have, that they won't change. Well, we know that's not right, because there are some intervening variables, not the least of which is dramatic population growth. And so you're going to get different results with the same approaches and the same policies. So the real key is thinking about, as we change, what do we want to change toward? And so one of the concepts was this 3% solution. We could accommodate much of the growth on 3% of the land base in our community. And that 3% was composed of these centers that we talked about before, areas accessed by transit. And if we accommodated even just 10 or 20, 25% of population growth within this 3% of land, these targeted areas, we calculated dramatic benefits for the region in terms of water use, air quality, cost of living, impact on congestion, et cetera. And so I think the underlying message there was, again, you don't have to change everything. People can still have choices about where they live and how they live. But to some extent, the market, we need to let the market do its thing and let that growing percentage of the population that wants to live in places where they can walk to services, that want to be closer to where they work, that want to have transit access to the region, to have that choice. So again, I think the political message is, we don't need to come in and tell people how to live, and we don't want the legislature or city councils or others to come in and direct how we're gonna live. But we can provide more choices for people so that those that wanna live in those areas can, and there are regional benefits for all of us in doing that.
What a good transition to my next question. I wanted to talk about NIMBYism and just this resistance to change that we've been discussing. You know, how to address that. That's a really tricky topic, and it's a heavy political lift for a lot of local leaders. You know, how do you address that in the details? How do you address the us versus them attitudes? Clark, I mean, home building. We talk about density. How do you get more density and meet the demand? We saw the demand. There is demand for townhomes and condos and that type of living. You know, how do you get there, and how do you deal with communities?
Everyone loves us. Everyone loves us, you know that. No, it's true. It doesn't matter where you are in the most progressive city or the most conservative city, they fight you equally hard. And you know, that gets to the little picture we saw earlier in Berkeley, where, you know, Black Lives Matter, but then they were opposing a multifamily development just down the street. It's challenging, and I think what's happening in our state is that we are seeing that our state leaders are having to be more proactive because cities are not getting it quick enough. And so some cities are, but other cities are dragging their feet. And that's going to be the challenge. I think that the biggest thing, though, that we all have to realize is that if we don't do what we need to do to keep housing more reasonable, more moderate in its price, then we will lose our job creation machine. And what we have to get every city council, every planning commission, every mayor to understand is that moderately priced housing equals jobs. And it's not without reasonable housing solutions that we will have people continue to, you know, relocate their businesses to Utah or expand their businesses in Utah. I think if we don't get on this really quickly, some of our best companies will start exporting their job creation to surrounding areas where housing is more affordable. We were, until just a few years ago, sort of 100% of the median house price in the US. Utah's median was very close to the US median. Today we're more like, I think, 120%. And as we get more out of balance with our surrounding areas, it's much more affordable to go to Phoenix, even though Phoenix has been a hot market. You know, there are different markets now in Texas, in Arizona, in surrounding markets that are competing with us for jobs that are offering better housing options for a lower price. So if we can work with cities and they can sort of see that economic development and housing are tied, then I think we will have a win. And we're going to try to stress that more and more and try to bring in the experts that can help the councils and the mayors see that. Then I think maybe we'll prevail. If not, then I think our state leadership will continue to force the issue, and that needs to happen because one way or another we need to solve these problems.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm sure this is working. So, a little question. How many square feet of non-residential space do you have in the Wasatch Front? Anybody know? It's about 500 million square feet, give or take. In 2050, how many square feet of that 500 million will be way beyond its useful life and would have to be replaced? About 400 million square feet. How many acres is that? I'm doing the quick of the back of the envelope. I can't number too many zeros, but it's in the tens of thousands of acres of land between now and 2050, where you've got a 0.2 FAR building, meaning that
you take an acre of land and only 20% of it has the structure on it, and the other 80% is asphalt. Virtually all of the Wasatch Front growth, jobs, people, can be put on these parking lots between now and 2040, 2050, 2100, without going any further out than the Wasatch Front. And we have the design talent to do that. The infrastructure is pretty much already there. The road system is already there. We have transit ready or existing transit corridors where that can happen. Now let's get to the NIMBY side of this. I actually had a first-hand experience with the NIMBY arguments in Salt Lake City when I taught at the University of Utah. I was invited to be the expert to neighborhood councils in the avenues some years ago, and I was worried. You know, these are people who want to protect their neighborhood. I get all that, and they were looking to me to stop light rail from having high-rise buildings down the street from them. Okay, I was a setup guy, so I walked in. I said, okay, I know what you want to do. You don't want to have encroachment in your neighborhood. I get that. Look down the street, and we were sitting in a community center, and I said, you know, look down the street. Can you actually see the track station from here? No, too many trees. You can go 7 floors at the track station, and you wouldn't see it because it'd be below the tree line. And oh, by the way, if those 7 floors weren't built there, the market would probably have to move into your neighborhood to meet the market demand, to tear down the older homes, the smaller homes. Do you want that? So here's the deal. You support the tracks development and around the area, and the trade-off is we'll protect your neighborhood. And they liked that idea. They took it to city council. They didn't vote on it, but there was this undercurrent of support. Okay, you protect our neighborhoods, and we'll support the development around tracks. So let's take all of these parking lots and let's cut deals with neighborhoods and say, okay, look, another 1 million people or 2 million people are gonna be coming here, like it or not, we gotta go someplace. They're either gonna go into your neighborhood, or you help us redevelop parking lots along transit corridors, along the 3% areas that Alan was talking about, and we'll protect your neighborhoods if you support us by redeveloping these parking lots. I don't know how far that'll go, but it's just an idea that might help unlock thousands of acres of land between now and 2050. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, half of Americans want the opportunity, not that they would choose it, they want the opportunity to be in a walkable community. We know that about 1/3 to 40% of Americans want to live in middle housing opportunities, which means the townhouse and the bungalow house and the walk-up apartment and condo and so on and so forth, maximum 3-floor structures. So the opportunity is there in the market. We just have to seize and leverage the opportunities and put them on the parking lots and everything else. And that's sort of revisioning, if you will, Utah for the future.
Alan, I see you're chomping at the bit.
Sure, just quickly. I served on planning commissions for 18 years. I know a little bit about NIMBY. I've been the target of some angry meetings. I know it's real, I know it's hard to avoid, but just one thought is something that was started here, and that's an understanding of values. We've heard that word earlier today, but one of the things that Envision Utah did, I think for the first time, was use values studies, values analysis to drive urban planning. Now this was a technique that's pretty sophisticated that was used to sell cars and soda and hamburgers before. But we used it for the first time here to understand what people want out of life and how the design of our communities can help get that. So this isn't polling, it's finding out what drives your decisions. And just as an example, you ask people, what do you like, what don't you like about life on the Wasatch Front? And one of the things is that don't like traffic congestion. Well, what's the functional reason why? Why don't you like traffic congestion? Well, it wastes my time. Okay, what's the social or psychic reason? Say, if you had that time back, what would you do with it? Well, I'd do my job better, or I'd spend more time outdoors. But most people said, I'd spend more time with my family. Why does that matter to you? Well, my children are growing up in a difficult world. If I can spend more time with them, I can help them prepare for that. I can help them be more successful. I love them. And so here we find this link between traffic congestion and the value of family love, and can find those links on a range of issues, feelings of security, beauty in the area, etc. Why is it important to understand the values? Well, one reason was we found that regardless of religion, politics, economic situation, the values of people in Utah were largely the same. And they were largely focused on the future and the people that we're going to follow. We found that you could communicate with people better rather than talking about statistics and congestion patterns, etc. You start talking in terms of those values. What kind of world do you want for your kids? And we found that if you plan based on the kind of world we want in 50 years, it gets to people's values. Whereas if you say, here's a development going in down the street, you immediately reach for your pocketbook and say, what's that going to mean to me? And that divides people. So it's not a full solution, but I think continuing to understand our values, speak to those values, and think ahead is going to help us. And I'll give you just one data point. Peter Calthorpe was in town several years ago. He started working with Envision Utah and then was doing some work on the west side of the valley. And he spoke to a group of community leaders and said, I've worked all over the world with communities, planning for the future. And Utah's different in two ways. He said, one, there's a willingness to collaborate here that I've never seen anywhere before. And as we get caught in our battles, we sometimes say, really? But you hear that from enough people that I think there's something to that. We want to solve problems. And he said, number two, there's a concern for the next generation that I've never seen anywhere else. There's a feeling here that we've got a responsibility for those who are going to follow us, for our families and others. That's a powerful value that we can build on in changing our urban fabric, in solving the problems we have today. So it's not just about us, but how can we make the world better for those that we love? People even that we don't know, but we care enough about that we want to create the world that they want.
That was what I was referring to this morning. I'm glad you brought it up. I wanted to make one point. I think there is a lesson to be learned from California on the whole NIMBY question. It is very difficult to change a NIMBY's mind. It is possible to create a countervailing political force, and that is what has happened in California with the rise of California's YIMBY movement, which is generational, right? It's mostly younger folks, and they have very effectively moved on three fronts. Number one is they've become very effective in lobbying the legislature. And number two, they're very active in they're very active in court. Recently, there was one of these expedited permitting processes that the state passed, and there was a project in Burbank, which tried to go through under that expedited process. The city resisted it. The developer made a deal with the city, but YIMBY Law, which is a public interest law firm, actually resisted the settlement and on principle continues to sue. And the third thing they do really well is they are very good at trolling on social media. So, so there's this guy, for example, in the Bay Area who's part of the YIMBY movement, and he either tunes in or goes to the housing policy meetings in all of the really affluent communities. And he live tweets every ridiculous thing that anybody says, like what's going to happen to our horses, right? That kind of thing. And the result of that has been, and if many people, and if you haven't read the book Golden Gates by Connor Doherty, that describes the rise of the YIMBY movement in the Bay Area. It's a very good book. He's a reporter for the New York Times. But this countervailing force of the YIMBY movement, which again is generational, has become so strong that although there is NIMBY opposition to projects around the state, the statewide NIMBY movement, which was attempting to influence the legislature, has essentially withered and died.
This will probably be our last question before we have to wrap up for break. But speaking of love for the next generation, let's talk about housing affordability. Even more dense forms types of housing like condos or townhomes I've seen run in the 400,000 range. I wouldn't really call that affordable. How do we get at this affordability issue while tackling Utah's housing shortage issues and this larger discussion about growth? I'm just going to open it up to whoever wants to answer it.
Well, I'll just go quick. There's no question that there's not one solution, but there's hundreds, and we need to work on hundreds of solutions. They relate to regulatory reform at every city, the way we look at cost, standards for development, being careful and considering everything that comes through a city for approval. How will it impact affordability? We need to look at construction and design. We need to have new techniques. We don't have hardly any modular construction going on in Utah. There's a lot of it starting to happen in other areas. We need a big modular construction factory here that big builders can pull on. There's some good companies like Builders First Source that are doing things that are panelized, et cetera, but we can do a lot more. We can do a lot more with design, both of communities and of homes that will be more efficient. I think part of the answer is having smaller units available, which will be a big key. Finance needs to change not only here, but in the United States. We need new solutions in finance. There will be co-ownership things that happen throughout the country and happen more and more here that will allow investors to be alongside of those that own homes and participate in the upside in order to help them get in. It helps you eliminate mortgage insurance. It helps you do a lot of other things. Some of these make sense, others don't. The biggest innovation in housing affordability was the 30-year mortgage. That came decades ago. What will the next big innovation be? Will we go to 40-year mortgages? Will we do other things that will help us to get lower payments? It makes sense. A home can be in a family for way more than 30 years, and it doesn't matter that if they're refinancing, it just allows that opportunity. I think there's all kinds of solutions and also for apartment and lower income that have to do with finance that we need to consider. We need to engage the nonprofit community. We need to engage our cities. We need to have more public-private partnerships. But it's dozens and dozens of things, and cities need to be open to it. Our young people will push us in that direction. We're seeing it now. We have dozens of students that are taking our housing innovation courses, and these guys have amazing ideas, and we need to see those come to fruition. So I'm optimistic. I think we will even have greater opportunities now that we have a little bit of a slowdown in our market. This has been really, we have not been able to keep pace. It's been out of control. And the next period of time, over the next few years, will bring an opportunity for incredible new thinking, new innovation that will impact in a positive way affordability.
Chris?
Well, that's quite a list, Clark, and I can't top the list, but why don't we redefine what affordability means? So as Alan mentioned in the point, what if you don't have to have the second car? That means the cost of the second car is avoided. What is the cost of the second car? It's roughly 10% of the household budget. Right now, households spend about 20% of their budget on transportation. 30% roughly goes to housing, and 30% is the magical affordable housing number. So if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, then the housing is unaffordable. But what if you're saving 10% because of your location and the point? Can't you just add that 10% savings to the cost of the house? Move your budget from 30% to 40%. You're no worse off, and you're probably better off as a consequence. So we need to add the transportation element into the affordable housing equation. And if you do that, then you might become more flexible in the financing piece, because lenders will say, oh, you live in the point. Your housing budget can be 40% because you're saving so much money on the transportation side. We'll give you a higher loan-to-value ratio. So another little thing to add to the dozens of things in Clark's quiver.
There was actually a developer in San Diego who subsidized car share on site specifically for that reason, for the buyers to be able to dump the second car and pay more for the house, which I thought was interesting. I think Clark's list is right. I would just say there is, in very expensive markets such as California, there is this debate about whether or not the private market can solve the problem. There are those who have lost faith in the private market and believe that the only way to provide affordable housing is to provide income-restricted affordable housing, and that in San Francisco now the prevailing view is that all new housing should be income-restricted. I disagree with that because I think part of the problem we have today is that we underbuilt, particularly in California, in the last 30 years, and so the filter down has not occurred the way it has in the past. So I think you need both, but I think a lot of Clark's ideas go to a fundamental question, which is how do you motivate developers to build deeper into the market so they're not only building at the top end? That's not necessarily a municipal issue. I think it goes to it does go to housing type, and it goes to housing finance. Many of the things Clark talked about.
Alan?
Yeah, and I'd say amen. I think I was going to make the H+T, the housing plus transportation point, but Chris did it in a much more compelling way. Maybe I'll just end with the obvious, and that this is something we need to address. Clark mentioned earlier how much it means for job creation in our area. As we're reaching out to attract companies to this area, affordability is a significant consideration. As we're trying to attract talent to what we hope will be Utah's innovation community, a place where there's this culture of creativity, where we're going to have research and incubators and accelerators and venture capital and all these efforts to generate commercialization opportunities, but also solve problems in our community. Getting the best talent here depends very much on affordability. And the next thing I'd say is, if we want to keep our families together, if we want those that we love to be able to stay with us and not move somewhere else, that ought to be as much of a motivator as anything.
Thank you, guys. That wraps it up for this portion of the discussion.
Thank you, panel. That was terrific.